When George Washington stayed at the home of Tunis Dey in 1780, the Revolutionary War had been raging for 5 years already. During that time, George Washington had traveled with the Continental Army up and down the eastern seaboard, from Massachusetts to Maryland and then back up again. Washington had headquartered at over 100 different locations during this period. Sometimes he stayed at taverns or inns. At least one time he stayed in a church. But most of the time, George Washington would headquarter in a home. Sometimes that was a vacated home of a loyalist. Sometimes it was the home of a distinguished member of the community, or a Continental officer, or sometimes the home of a friend. The general chose Tunis Dey's home due to its strategic location. It was near Passaic Falls, where the Army was encamped. And it was also near New York City, which the British had occupied since shortly after the start of the Revolutionary War. George Washington had hoped to retake the city if the opportunity arose. Washington had known Tunis Dey for several years. Besides his patriot credentials, Tunis Dey was a colonel in the Bergen County Militia, as were his 6 sons. The two had much in common. Both were large landowners and gentlemen farmers, and they were roughly about the same age, with Tunis Dey being about 5 years older. When George Washington arrived at a headquarters, he brought with him a lot of people and a lot of stuff. Several carriages would arrive containing furniture, which included bookcases or chairs or tables, whatever maybe the home didn't have. It would also have several trunks of official records. There would be clothing and bedding and chinaware and toiletries, as well as food and wine. On top of this, the general was accompanied by 40 to 80 lifeguards who were responsible for his security. He was also accompanied by his aides and secretaries, as well as laundresses, cooks, a horse tenderer, and servants, both free and enslaved. George Washington arrived at Dey Mansion on Saturday, July 1st, 1780. While we don't know the precise details of how he spent his days here, we can recreate what an average day would have looked like for him by what we know about how he spent his days at other encampments during the war. He was an early riser and would wake sometimes at 4 o'clock in the morning. He'd been accompanied by his enslaved manservant, William Billy Lee, since the start of the war. Lee assisted Washington in getting ready in the morning. He would help him shave and lay out his clothes and help fix his hair. Washington spent the pre-dawn hours right here in his office working with some of his most trusted aides. He may have been joined by Tench Tillman, who was Washington's good friend as well as one of his most valuable wartime assistants. Or he may have been joined by the young Alexander Hamilton, who at the time he was staying here at Dey's house was courting Eliza Schuyler, who he would marry later that year in Albany. Or he may have been joined by Robert Hanson Harrison, the oldest of Washington's aides at 35 years old, and who had served as Washington's lawyer prior to the war. After breakfast commenced the main portion of the working day. George Washington would have returned to his office here to continue working, and his aides to their adjoining room. We do know that he was very busy while here at Dey Mansion. He wrote and received over 1,000 letters, with correspondence that included local officials, the Continental Congress, and generals in the field. They dealt with supplies and military strategy, and he even managed a spy ring while here at Dey Mansion. When George Washington stayed here at Dey's home in 1780, these were some of the darkest times of the Revolutionary War. The Continental Army was coming off of a difficult encampment in Morristown. The American economy was in shambles. The Continental Army was woefully short on basic supplies of clothing and food. And in the South, the Patriot Army had suffered critical defeats at Camden and Charleston, South Carolina. But the lowest point of the war came about 2 months after George Washington left Dey's house, when he discovered that his most capable and valuable general, Benedict Arnold, had turned traitor and betrayed the Patriot cause. After George Washington had discovered that Benedict Arnold had turned traitor, he didn't know who to trust. He didn't know what secrets the British knew, and he didn't know who else might have turned traitor on his staff. He had also learned of plans by the British to kidnap him in retaliation for the hanging of Major John Andre, who was Benedict Arnold's British co-conspirator. But George Washington did trust Tunis Dey and the location of his home. So on Sunday, October 8, 1780, George Washington returned to Dey Mansion to set up headquarters once again. But while these were dark times of the Revolutionary War, there were also signs of hope. The French had landed troops at Newport, Rhode Island under the leadership of General Rochambeau, and Washington had met with Rochambeau in between his stays here at Dey's house in Hartford, Connecticut to coordinate military strategy. And of the hundreds of correspondences that George Washington wrote while here at Dey's house, perhaps none was more important than on October 22, 1780, when he assigned General Nathaniel Greene to lead the Southern Department of the Continental Army. In the South, the Army had been beaten and demoralized, but under Greene, the foundations had been laid for victory at Yorktown in October 1781. By 3 p.m., the bulk of the workday was done for George Washington, and it was time for dinner, either in the Great Hall or perhaps right here back in his office. While business was certainly discussed, this was a time to relax and have calm and agreeable conversation. Along with Tillman, Hamilton, and Harrison, George Washington was also joined by his other aides, James McHenry, Richard Kidder Meade, and the most recent to join George Washington's staff, David Humphreys. Dinner was served on fine china and silverware, and the multiple dishes would have included meats and soups and pastries and bread and vegetables from both local and seasonal crops. George Washington enjoyed this time with his military family, and the meal can last between 2 and 3 hours. We do know while here at Dey's Mansion that George Washington had hosted Lord Stirling, Generals Henry Knox and Nathaniel Greene and Anthony Wayne, as well as the Marquis de Lafayette and Aaron Burr. George Washington also hosted a grand dinner for the Marquis de Chastellux, a major general on General Rochambeau's staff. Chastellux would go on to write the only first-hand account that we have of George Washington's stay here at Dey's house. After dinner may have been the time for some invigorating physical activity. Washington may have gone on a riding party with some of his aides or guests. Washington was physically imposing at 6'2", with a very athletic build. For exercise, he might have thrown a leather ball with his aides, or may have played a game of wicket, a game played with a ball and a bat, the predecessor to the American pastime of baseball. At around 7:30, as the sun was setting, it was time for supper. This was a light evening meal that consisted of leftovers from dinner, fruit, hickory nuts, and George Washington's favorite, the sweet and syrupy Madeira wine. This was a time where he can relax with the closest of his military aides. The pressure on George Washington during the Revolutionary War was immense. Literally, the fate of the United States of America was on his broad shoulders. On November 27th, George Washington left the home of Tunis Dey for his winter quarters in New York. Washington was pleased with his stay, and in addition to paying Dey for his accommodations, also offered a $50 tip to Dey's servants. His stay here of over 3 months was one of the longest periods he had stayed in one place during the Revolutionary War, outside of the winter quarters, when the army was quiescent. The Revolutionary War was won in the halls of the Continental Congress, in the taverns and homes of patriots throughout this young country, on the battlefield such as Trenton and Princeton and Monmouth, and in places like Dey Mansion. As Lin-Manuel Miranda sung in Hamilton, you want to be in the room where it happens. And for George Washington, it happened in these rooms, right here at Dey Mansion.